Hello, I'm Dr. Ryan Anderson. This webinar is designed to help you learn more about qEEGs, which is an instrument we use to measure the function of the brain, and prTMS, which is an intervention we use that directly improves brain functioning. Now, as we go through this webinar, I'd like to make a quick suggestion that you take time to either write down some notes, especially to write down questions that you might have or points of confusion that you'd like to have clarified. That way, when we have the opportunity to talk to each other during our consultation, we can make sure we get all of those cleared up for you. Now, of course, we're talking about the brain today, and a basic understanding of brain functioning is that the brain has three major things that it does to fulfill its functions. First, the brain creates pathways. These are literal physical pathways made out of brain cells known as neurons, and they connect the different parts of the brain that are responsible for perception, thoughts, feelings, memory, decision making. And when we create good mental, physical, and relational habits, the more we follow those lines of behavior. So, for example, if I have a negative emotion, but I use a positive coping skill, the brain builds more and more neurons to connect those parts. So it becomes easier, faster, more natural, and more efficient to make those decisions. Of course, that can also work in a negative way. If I have negative emotions and I'm responding with poor maladaptive coping skills, it can build these neuron superhighways to those as well. So when we're doing therapy, when we're evaluating our thoughts and feelings, we're creating new paths of thinking, feeling, acting, and interacting. What we're doing is we're working on building up healthy neuronal pathways and trimming back unhealthy neuronal pathways. Now, these neurons communicate with each other through a means of neurochemicals. There's a variety of neurochemicals like dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine. And when the neurons send a message to each other, they release a combination of these chemicals, which is like a really complicated code, sending vast amounts of information in a very efficient way. Now, if these neurotransmitters aren't being transmitted correctly, that can lead to all kinds of problems like depression, etc. Now, a lot of the medications that we use in psychiatry are designed to try to do something about these neurotransmitters. For example, a lot of antidepressants are what are known as an SSRI, or a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. The whole idea behind these medicines is they slow down how quickly the body is reabsorbing serotonin so that there's a better chance that the serotonin will move from the transmitter to the receiver and that enough of it gets there that it hits a threshold to cause the neuron to fire. Because that's at the very core of all brain activities, the actual firing of the neuron. That's where the information is generated, processed, and passed on. And so that's the most important piece of brain functioning. And if that's not going well, it's very hard for anything else going on in the brain to be particularly successful. Now, the brain's job is to help the whole body keep itself in a healthy balance and to make decisions that are adaptive for it. And in some ways, it's like the brain has a thermostat, this idea that there's a certain balance point inside your body, and the thermostat is set to that point. And everything your brain does from there on is to try to maintain homeostasis or balance at that level. And just like with a thermostat, if it gets too warm or too cold, it kicks in the air conditioner or the heater to change things up or down. The brain does this for the whole body, including itself. The problem is, if something happens that throws the brain out of balance, these feedback loops can also serve to keep the brain out of balance. It's like someone has set the thermostat incorrectly, and that makes it much harder to heal. This is one of the reasons that certain forms of depression, anxiety, and other mental health symptoms are not responding very well to medication, is because while we're working with the transmitters, the neurons themselves aren't firing in a healthy way, and it's stuck in these negative feedback loops. Now, let's talk a little bit about how neurons work. Neurons work by charging up and firing off an electrical charge within themselves. And how often they do this is measured in frequency. So, for example, if a neuron is firing 1 times per second, that generates a waveform that has 1 hertz, is measured in 1 hertz. If it's 10 times per second, it's 10 hertz. And one thing to keep in mind is that different levels of activity, different frequencies of firing, are adaptive in different circumstances. So, for example, delta waves are 0.5 to 4 hertz, and that's really useful for deep, dreamless sleep. It's restorative. We need that. Without that, we won't be very healthy. But if we're at delta waves when we're trying to have this conversation, it's going to mean that we can't concentrate, that we can't think about what's going on. In fact, we probably won't even be very conscious, almost catatonic. Theta waves are a deeper level as well. They're creativity, insight, deep sleep, dreams, meditation. This is also very important. Alpha is kind of our relaxed state where we're kind of in idle mode at 8 to 13 hertz. Beta is where we're awake and we're alert, we're conscious, we're thinking about things. And then gamma waves, the fastest ones, 32 to 100 fires per second, are where we're in high performance areas. So maybe we're snowboarding, maybe we're learning something and it's really engaging our brains, maybe we're problem solving, maybe we're under a stressful situation. And each one of these is effective under the right circumstances. But if the brain is firing at alpha when it needs to be at gamma, or at theta when it needs to be at beta, we're going to be running into some problems. And the general way of understanding this is that if things are firing too slowly, we tend to see a lot of symptoms like lack of focus, depression, sluggishness, brain fog, difficulties with motivation, and so forth. And if it's firing too fast, we tend to see anxiety, lack of impulse control, hypervigilance, PTSD type stuff, the person just feeling stressed out, and so forth. And also, beyond just how fast or how slow it's firing, other problems can be, well, maybe it's firing inconsistently. It's bouncing back and forth between the right speed, then too fast, too slow, and it's not consistent. Or if the different parts of the brain are firing at different speeds and therefore not really coordinating their efforts well together, that causes all kinds of traffic jams within the brain. So, how do we measure brain waves? Well, here at Telos, we use a qEEG. And to perform a qEEG, which stands for qualitative electroencephalograph, in other words, we're saying how often are your neurons firing during the process of measurement. We have this helmet that we wear. It is wireless, it is gelless, and each one of these round nodules you see on the helmet is placed over a crucial portion of the brain. Then, over the period of about 4 minutes, we have the person get in a comfortable chair, close their eyes, and put themselves in a position where, if everything's going well, the brain will be working in the alpha wave zone. And then we simply measure over that period of time how often the neurons in that area are firing. What is the frequency of the firing? And then from there, it begins to create a graph for us that lets us know what's going on. Here you see the different parts of the brain that we're measuring. You'll notice the parts in red are the back of the brain. The one on the very bottom is your heart rate, but this deals with things like our visual processing, colors, shapes. The middle brain has to do with certain forms of memory and auditory processing. And the frontal portion of your brain is where the thinking, the reasoning, the decision making, the emotional regulation, the empathy, all of those really important functions are occurring. Now, what you see here is a very healthy looking qEEG result. It's not perfect, but it's pretty healthy. What about this is looking healthy? Well, first of all, we're seeing that the peaks are all in the proper range. You'll notice we put a box around the alpha range. And all of these have a peak that's there in the alpha range. That's what we want to see. So it's situational appropriateness. The brain is firing in alpha when alpha is the right thing to do. The next thing that we're seeing here is that the peaks are relatively high and narrow. Right now, this peak is right around 10 or 11 hertz or so. And you'll notice that it's very tall, meaning most of the time it was firing at that exact amount. There were a couple fires that were a little bit less, a couple that were a little bit more, and there's always going to be a little bit of extra energy to the left there. That's to be expected. But what you see is that this is pretty efficient and consistent. Most of the time, it's firing at the same frequency with a bell curve distribution around it that's pretty narrow. That's really what we want to see. And then the other thing that looks really good about this is the peaks in the different part of the brain are all lined up with each other, which lets us know that there's good connectivity and collaboration going on between the different parts of the brain. Another thing that we do besides the qEEG is we also have a number of neurocognitive tests that we give to our participants. And these can measure anything from depression, anxiety, ADHD, autism, concussions, sleep, OCD, whatever it is that we need to take a look at, in addition to looking at the actual functioning of the brain. And especially when we take a look at these combined with the qEEG, first of all, it helps us get a sense of what the person is subjectively experiencing. And we also get a sense of the actual progress they're making through the combination of these two measures. So when you get your results, we'll discuss those with you specifically and help you take a look at how those stack up against a qEEG from someone who's functioning in a pretty healthy way. Now, if we find that there are problems with the brain frequency firing of the neurons, and we want to say, hey, is there something we can do to help treat these? That's where prTMS comes in. Now, prTMS stands for Personalized Repetitive Transcranial Magnetic Stimulation. That's a mouthful. But what it is a safe, a non-invasive, and a highly effective way to correct issues with these problematic neuron firing patterns that can occur for people. One of the wonderful things about prTMS is it's not designed just to try to treat specific symptoms. Rather, we're working on helping treat the entire brain, helping the whole brain work better and more efficiently. And that results in an improvement in a wide variety of symptoms, including symptoms that are beyond the ones that we're specifically hoping will change. One of the wonderful things about prTMS, especially compared to older versions of transcranial magnetic stimulation, is that it has a fantastic rate of response. Over 90% of people who take prTMS treatments have a positive response to it. And the good news is we can know pretty quickly if you're going to be someone who responds well, or if you happen to be one of those 10% of people who for some reason don't respond. But this is an amazing response rate. And also, transcranial magnetic stimulation is an FDA approved treatment. It first received FDA approval in 2008. So this is established science. The good news is that prTMS is the most advanced version of transcranial magnetic stimulation that is available. Well, how does it change neuron functioning? What prTMS does is it uses a paddle, which you see represented here above this person's head, to create a highly controlled magnetic field. Now, I want to be clear, we are not putting electricity into people's heads. Rather, what we're doing is we're helping the brain fire off its own electrical impulses. How does that work? Well, the short version of the physics comes down to something known as Faraday's law of induction. And what Faraday's law of induction teaches us is that a moving magnetic field will cause electrical activity in any nearby conductors. And brain cells are amazing electrical conductors. So by moving a magnetic field through them, we stimulate the electrical activity of the brain cells. And if we pulse the magnetic field in a specific way, it causes the neurons within the magnetic field to fire at the same frequency. So if we wanted the neurons in a specific area of the brain to fire at 10 hertz, we simply pulse that magnetic field 10 times per second. And we find that the neurons in that area of the brain all respond in kind. So what treatment looks like, you'll notice we have this black paddle here, and we start off by placing this paddle up against a specific target zone. We then turn it on for a few seconds, and it pulses at the frequency that we've identified that the brain is wanting to fire at, but is having trouble firing at. Then we rest. So that period of firing the electromagnet is called a train. There's a resting period in between each train, and we train each portion of the brain a number of times per session. We then move the electromagnetic paddle to the next target zone, and we repeat the process. And this takes about 20 to 45 minutes. When we first start, it takes longer because we're giving the brain a longer rest in between the trains. But as the brain gets more used to the treatment, we can do more of them with a shorter rest in between. How does it feel? It's actually quite relaxing. Mostly what you feel would be the equivalent of someone just very lightly tapping in the area of your head that we're currently targeting. It's not painful, it's not uncomfortable. And oftentimes there's a very relaxing sensation that goes along with it, almost like being in a brain spa. There is a clicking sound, but it's very soft. It's not loud, abrasive, or hard to be around. Most people barely notice it and don't feel troubled by it at all. But that's all it feels like. There's nothing uncomfortable about the process. Now, over time, here's what we tend to see is in between the sessions, after the brain waves have all kind of aligned with the frequency we put them on, they slowly drift away back to where they were before. But as we repeat the sessions, which we usually do 5 times a week, Monday through Friday, and the usual length of treatment is somewhere between 6 to 8 weeks under most circumstances. Over that time, the brain becomes accustomed to having the neurons fire at the correct levels. And essentially what happens is the brain resets its thermostat and says, okay, so I get it now. This is where I'm supposed to be firing at. And I'm going to reset all of those internal feedback loops to work to keep myself firing in that proper zone. And so with that, the brain is now firing in a way that is more accurate, that is more consistent, and that is more collaborative between the different portions of the brain. And here's just an example of what this can look like. On the left here is a sample qEEG. You'll notice what's concerning about this. First of all, there are some peaks, but they are very broad and spread out and wide. And there's a lot of extra energy on the left side. This would suggest that this person's brain is both under firing a lot of the time and firing very inconsistently. The middle graph was somewhere in the middle of treatment, and at the end is where things are. You'll notice we don't expect someone to get to perfection, but you'll notice that the peaks have gotten much more narrow, much more aligned. A lot of the extra energy has drained out from the other areas. This is a much, much healthier functioning brain than when the person began. And also what we find is that they're also saying, yes, they feel better. They're sleeping better. They're concentrating better. They're feeling much less depressed, much less anxious. Now let's talk about side effects. The beautiful thing about prTMS is there are no long-term side effects. The short-term side effects are pretty simple and pretty easy to deal with. Like I mentioned previously, a lot of people may feel somewhat drowsy while they're having the trains happen. That is because we're using a lot of energy in the brain, and also because we're putting the brain into its proper alpha zone. And what is alpha zone for? It's for relaxing. So that's what you feel. Now, there's a number of people who also, kind of at the end of each treatment session, will notice that they're having a bit of a slight headache. Again, that's because the brain is burning up a lot of glucose, using a lot of energy. What we do is after each treatment, we give you a small snack, and that replenishes the glucose levels in your brain and resolves the headache very quickly. And again, it's not like people are having a massive headache. It's usually minor and barely noticeable. The other side effect that is known is that for some people with a history of seizures, there is a very small risk that a prTMS treatment might set off a seizure. But those are the only documented side effects out there. Well, what about the outcomes? Like I mentioned, there's a 90% response rate. So the vast majority of people who use prTMS get good benefit from it. And what you see here on the right, this isn't the number of the percentage of people who had this outcome. This is the percentage of improvement that the average person experienced. So almost everyone experiences improvement in sleep by 28%. And so they're falling asleep better, they're sleeping longer, the quality of their sleep is improved, and they notice this impacts all kinds of other mental functions, and they're just genuine emotional availability and ability to manage emotions. For people under the age of 18, we see an improvement in ADHD symptoms of 39%. There's a 44% improvement in neurological symptoms, so that can be things like brain fog. There's a 49% improvement in depression and a 51% improvement in anxiety. So it takes those and cuts them in half. For people on the autism spectrum, some of the difficult symptoms they might deal with, like stress sensitivity, emotional and cognitive rigidity, and so forth, those symptoms improve by 61%. And for people above the age of 18, ADHD symptoms improve by 65%. But beyond that, there's oftentimes a wide variety of other mental improvements that people are noticing beyond these specific ones that we're targeting. Again, that's because we're not going after symptoms. We're working on treating the brain as a whole. So, a lot of people who have completed prTMS find that they're able to reduce their use of psychiatric medications, which is nice because that helps them reduce side effects or other difficulties they have with their medication. And there's a significant percentage of prTMS recipients who are actually able to stop using their medications altogether. But that's something that should be done in consultation with a psychiatrist and something we would work with you on to evaluate after you're done with prTMS. Now, one thing to keep in mind is just because someone has had their brain tuned up doesn't mean that that automatically changes all of their patterns of behavior. If they didn't have good study skills before prTMS, they won't magically have good study skills after prTMS. Or if they struggled with emotional regulation before, their emotions will be a lot more accessible, but they still have the choice whether to use healthy or unhealthy coping skills. So the person still needs to put forth an effort to develop healthy patterns of dealing with thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and relationships. But they feel better, they're better rested, their brain is working better, they have more mental and emotional capacity available to them, and the efforts they put into making changes are much more likely to be successful and much less strenuous for them to do. So it makes the process of change easier and faster and more effective, and you already feel so much better. So this is the reason why for many, many people, prTMS is a game changer. Another thing that's wonderful about prTMS is that the benefits are long lasting. Typically, people only ever need to go through one round of treatment, and they're able to keep the benefits long term. Longitudinal studies show that most people keep the vast majority of their improvements. Now, there are a couple of known things that can disrupt the benefits that people have received from prTMS. So, getting a head trauma can disrupt it. Having a significant traumatic event can disrupt it. Drug abuse absolutely can disrupt it. And just poor sleep habits, not trying to get to bed at a good time, sleep through the night, that can be really disruptive to mental health in general, and especially will interfere with prTMS. However, the good news is if one of those things were to occur, and the person decided they wanted to kind of get back on track or get some help to put things right again, the good news is that they can come back and do a booster session. And rather than having to do the whole 6 to 8 weeks, most of the time, simply doing 1 to 2 weeks of a booster is enough to get them back to where they were because the brain remembers the process. I hope this has been informative, and I'm looking forward to speaking with you more about qEEGs and prTMS. From a personal point of view, I would say that this is a treatment that I've actually used not just on my own clients and students, but also on my own family members. And it has been an amazing game changer for each of them. So I hope this is something that you will be interested in learning more about and exploring how this might be something that could be helpful to you.